The security alarm cut through the empty concert hall like a blade, and Elias Whitmore froze with his hand still resting on the wooden lid of the grand piano. Footsteps pounded down the marble staircase behind him. He knew, before he even turned around, that he had made a terrible mistake. "Step away from that piano right now," said a sharp voice. Vincent Hale, the hall's new general manager, stood at the bottom of the stairs with his phone raised, already dialing security. His eyes were narrow, suspicious, the eyes of a man who trusted no one who cleaned floors for a living. "Do you have any idea what that instrument is worth? Do you know how many people would love to have your job taken away from them tonight?" Elias lifted his hand slowly, the way a man surrenders when he has nowhere left to run. "I was only dusting the lid, sir," he said quietly. "I did not open it. I would never open it." That is not what it looked like from where I was standing. Vincent walked closer, his shoes clicking against the polished floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. "You have worked here 11 years, Whitmore. 11 years, and I still do not know a single thing about you. No family listed in your file. No history before this hall, just a name and a start date. That makes people nervous. It makes me nervous." Elias said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. The truth was buried so deep inside him that even he sometimes forgot where he had left it, like a key dropped into a river a lifetime ago. Vincent studied him a moment longer, then lowered his phone, though the threat in his voice did not soften. "One more incident. One more time I find you anywhere near this piano, and you will not need to explain yourself to me. You will explain yourself to the street outside, because that is where you will be standing." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing, until the heavy door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Elias exhaled and looked down at his hands. They were old hands now, marked with small scars and calluses from years of mop handles and cleaning cloths. But underneath the roughness, if anyone had looked closely enough, they would have noticed something strange. The fingers were too elegant for a janitor, too precise, too aware of their own strength. He pulled his cart toward the hallway and kept moving, because moving was the only thing that had ever helped him forget. Grand Aurora Hall was the pride of the city, a place where the finest orchestras in the country came to perform beneath painted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that had hung there since the hall was first built more than 100 years earlier. To the public, it was a place of beauty and wonder. To Elias, it was simply where he worked, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the last patron had gone home, pushing his cart through hallways filled with echoes of music he was never allowed to make. Nobody at the hall knew his real story. Nobody asked. To the young musicians who rehearsed there late into the night, he was invisible, a shape in gray overalls who emptied bins and mopped floors while they argued about tempo and dynamics. To the ushers, he was a name they occasionally called out when a spill needed cleaning. To Vincent Hale, he was a liability waiting to happen, a stranger with no past who had somehow been allowed to stay far too long. That evening, as he swept the lobby, 3 young musicians burst through the side door laughing, their voices bouncing off the walls with the easy confidence of people who had never been told no. Daniel Cole was the loudest of them, a violinist with quick hands and a quicker temper, always the first to make a joke and the last to apologize for it. Beside him walked Oliver Hunt, a cellist with a calm face that rarely showed what he was thinking, and trailing behind them was Charlotte Byrne, notebook in hand, always watching, always writing things down. "You are seriously telling me Maestro Reyes rejected your solo again?" Daniel said, dropping his violin case onto a bench with more force than necessary. "He said it lacked feeling," Oliver replied, shrugging. "Whatever that means. I played every note correctly." "That is exactly the problem," Charlotte said without looking up from her notebook. "Correct is not the same as alive." They continued past Elias without a glance, the way people walk past a lamppost, aware of it only enough not to bump into it. He kept sweeping, listening the way he always listened, absorbing every word about music the way a starving man watches other people eat. He had learned over the years to keep his face empty when musicians spoke about the piano, about tempo, about the ache of getting a phrase exactly right. It was easier that way, safer. If his face ever showed what he truly felt, someone might ask questions, and questions were the one thing Elias Whitmore could not afford. Later, in the small storage room behind the stage where he kept his cleaning supplies, Elias sat for a moment on an overturned bucket and rubbed his eyes. On the shelf above him, tucked behind a stack of folded rags, sat a small wooden box he had carried with him for more years than he cared to count. He never opened it at work. He barely opened it at home, but he always knew exactly where it was, the way a person always knows where an old wound sits beneath the skin, even long after it has stopped bleeding. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and told himself, as he told himself every single day that the past belonged in that box and nowhere else. Then he picked up his cart and continued his rounds, because work was the only thing that had ever been strong enough to hold his memories in place. He finished the lobby and moved toward the rehearsal room, where the grand piano sat beneath a soft spotlight, uncovered for the evening's practice. He was not supposed to linger there. Vincent's warning still rang in his ears, but something about the piano at night, gleaming and silent, always pulled at him the way the moon pulls at the tide, quiet and impossible to resist. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then Daniel's voice broke the silence behind him. "Careful, old man, that thing costs more than this whole building." Elias turned, startled, gripping the handle of his cart. Daniel, Oliver, and Charlotte had followed him in, clearly amused by the sight of the janitor staring at the piano like it belonged to another life entirely. "I was only checking the dust," Elias said, his voice steady despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "Sure you were," Daniel said, grinning at his friends. "You look at that piano like it owes you money." He walked closer, resting an elbow on the polished lid with the careless confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether he belonged in a room. "Have you ever even touched a piano, old-timer?" The question landed harder than Daniel probably intended. Elias felt something shift inside him, an old door creaking open after years of being sealed shut. "Once," Elias said quietly. "A long time ago." Oliver raised an eyebrow, more curious than mocking. "Did you play, or did you just clean around one?" Charlotte lowered her notebook slightly, watching Elias's face the way a journalist watches for the smallest crack in a story. Elias felt the familiar instinct rise inside him, the urge to shrink, to disappear, to let the moment pass without leaving a mark. He had spent decades perfecting the art of being forgettable. It had kept him safe. It had kept his secret buried where it belonged. But something about the way the lights caught the piano's black surface, something about the smell of polished wood and rosin that clung to the room, made the old ache rise up faster than he could push it down. "I used to know how to play," he said finally. "A little." Daniel laughed, not unkindly, but with the easy cruelty of the young. "A little. Right. Well, if you know how to play a little, why don't you show us? Come on, sit down." "I do not think that would be appropriate," Elias said, already backing toward his cart. "Why not?" Daniel pressed, stepping closer, enjoying the attention of his friends now gathering to watch. "It is just us. No one else is here. Come on, old man. Sit down and show us this hidden talent of yours." Oliver crossed his arms, smiling faintly. "This I have to see." Charlotte said nothing, but she did not look away either. And something in her steady gaze told Elias she was the one most likely to remember whatever happened next, whether he wanted her to or not. Elias looked at the piano bench. It seemed impossibly far away, though it stood only a few steps from where he was standing. His heart began to beat harder, a slow and heavy rhythm that felt dangerously close to panic. He had promised himself, decades ago, that he would never sit at a piano bench again. Not because he could not remember how, because he remembered exactly how, and remembering was the one thing he had spent his whole life trying to avoid. "Perhaps another time," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Come on," Daniel said, laughing louder now, clearly enjoying himself. "Do not tell me the great piano expert is scared of a few keys." The word "scared" struck something deep and old inside Elias, something that had nothing to do with Daniel or the piano or the late hour. It reminded him of another voice, softer, kinder, from long ago, telling him not to be scared of the stage, not to be scared of the lights, not to be scared of anything, because his hands would always know what to do even when his mind forgot. He felt his feet moving before he decided to move them. He crossed the room slowly, aware of every pair of eyes watching him, aware of the warning Vincent Hale had given him only hours earlier, aware that this single decision could cost him the only steady life he had built for himself in years. He reached the bench and lowered himself onto it, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight. The piano keys stretched out before him, pale and waiting, exactly the way they had waited for him every single day for 11 years, while he swept the floor around them, and never once let himself stop and truly look. Daniel folded his arms, smirking at Oliver. Charlotte lifted her notebook slightly, pen ready. Elias placed his hands above the keys, and for one long, trembling moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And that was precisely the moment the heavy door at the back of the hall creaked open, and a voice neither Elias nor the young musicians expected called out sharply through the darkness, freezing every single one of them in place. "What exactly is going on in here?" The voice belonged to Antonio Reyes, the hall's resident maestro, a man whose reputation for discipline was matched only by his reputation for genius. He stood in the doorway with a folder of scores tucked under one arm, his sharp eyes moving from Daniel to Oliver to Charlotte, and finally landing on Elias, who sat frozen at the piano bench with his hands still hovering above the keys. Daniel straightened immediately, the smirk vanishing from his face. "Maestro Reyes, we were showing him the piano. At this hour, in an empty rehearsal room, with the hall's cleaner sitting at a piano he has no business touching." Antonio's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, the tone of a man who had spent decades sensing when something was not being fully explained to him. "Someone want to tell me what is really happening here?" Elias began to rise from the bench, his hands trembling slightly, grateful for the interruption even as shame burned in his chest. "I apologize, sir. I was just leaving. It will not happen again." "Sit down," Antonio said. The words were quiet, but they carried an authority that made even Daniel take a small step backward. Elias hesitated, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "I said sit down," Antonio repeated, walking further into the room. "These three seem convinced you know how to play. I would like to see for myself before I decide whether anyone in this room is in trouble tonight." Elias felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Every instinct in his body told him to refuse, to apologize again, to push his card out of the room and never allow himself to be caught near a piano again as long as he lived. But something in Antonio's expression, some flicker of genuine curiosity beneath the sternness, made refusal feel suddenly impossible. He lowered himself back onto the bench. The room fell silent. Daniel exchanged a nervous glance with Oliver. Charlotte lifted her notebook again, pen hovering, though for the first time that evening she seemed to have forgotten she was supposed to be writing anything down. Elias looked at the keys. White and black, worn slightly at the edges from decades of use, exactly the shape and size he remembered, though his hands had not touched a piano properly in more years than he wanted to admit. He took a slow breath, the way he used to before every performance long ago, and let his fingers settle gently onto the keys. For a moment nothing happened. His hands simply rested there, trembling, uncertain, as though his own body had forgotten permission had been granted. Then something inside him shifted, quietly and completely, the way a key finally turns after years of rust. He began to play. The first note rang out clear and pure through the empty room, followed by a second, then a third, and within moments a melody unfolded that silenced every single person present. It was not the fumbling, uncertain playing of a hobbyist. It was precise, controlled, and impossibly expressive, each phrase rising and falling with an emotional weight that made the hair on Charlotte's arms stand up. Daniel's mouth fell open. Oliver took an unconscious step closer, as though pulled by an invisible string. Charlotte stopped writing entirely, her pen resting forgotten against the paper. Antonio Reyes went very still. He knew this piece. He had heard it performed exactly once before, decades earlier, by a young pianist whose name had once been spoken with the kind of awe usually reserved for legends. He had been a student then, sitting in the back row of a concert hall on the other side of the country, watching a performer whose talent had seemed almost impossible for a human being to possess. That performer had vanished from the music world entirely not long after, disappearing so completely that many assumed something terrible had happened to him. Antonio had never forgotten that performance. He had built much of his own career chasing the feeling that single concert had given him, the sense that music could reach directly into a person's chest and rearrange something permanently inside it. And now, standing in an empty rehearsal room, listening to an elderly janitor coax the same aching beauty out of the same piece, Antonio felt that old, impossible feeling rising in his chest all over again. Elias's hands moved faster now, the melody building toward its climax, his eyes closed, his face transformed by something none of the young musicians had ever seen on him before. The mask of quiet invisibility he had worn for 11 years had slipped away entirely, revealing something raw and luminous underneath. The music swelled through a series of rapid, cascading passages, each one more demanding than the last, and yet Elias's hands never faltered, never hesitated, moving across the keys with the fluid certainty of a river finding its old path down a mountainside it had carved decades earlier. Charlotte would later try to describe the sound to friends who had not been present, and every single time she would find herself at a loss for words, settling instead on the simple truth that it had felt less like listening to music and more like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for half a lifetime. When the final note faded into silence, nobody in the room moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was Elias's unsteady breathing as he opened his eyes, blinking as though waking from a dream he had not meant to fall into. Then, slowly, deliberately, Antonio Reyes set his folder of scores down on a nearby chair and began to clap. Daniel and Oliver quickly followed, their applause hesitant at first, then growing louder as the shock wore off. Charlotte simply stared, her notebook forgotten entirely on the floor beside her feet. "Where?" Antonio said, his voice tight with an emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "Did you learn to play like that?" Elias's hands were still resting on the keys, though they had begun to shake now, not from the music, but from the sudden exposure, the terrifying feeling of being seen after decades of successfully remaining invisible. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Before this job, before any of this." "That is not an answer," Antonio said, stepping closer. "That piece is extremely difficult. I have heard professional pianists struggle with the technical demands of the second movement alone. You did not simply play it. You understood it. You played it the way it is meant to be played, and I have only ever heard one other person play it that way in my entire life." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking the bench backward. "I should return to my work. I have already caused enough trouble for one evening." "Wait," Antonio said, his voice firm but no longer harsh. "Please, I am not trying to cause you trouble. I am trying to understand something extraordinary that just happened in this room." But Elias was already moving toward his cart, his hands still trembling, his heart pounding with a fear far older and far deeper than the fear of losing his job. He had spent decades building walls around the man he used to be, and tonight, in a matter of minutes, those walls had cracked wide open in front of three strangers, and a maestro whose eyes had seen straight through him. "Please," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper as he reached the doorway. "Do not tell anyone about this, I am begging you." Before Antonio could take a single step toward the door, it swung open again, this time with far less patience. Vincent Hale marched into the room, his phone still glowing in his hand, his expression already sharpened into a scowl. "I received 3 separate messages about noise coming from this room," Vincent said, glancing around at the young musicians before his eyes landed on Antonio. "Rehearsal ended 2 hours ago. What exactly is going on?" "Nothing that concerns you tonight, Vincent," Antonio said evenly. "A private matter." "Everything in this building concerns me," Vincent replied, stepping further inside. "That is literally my job. Where is Whitmore? I saw him leave through the side corridor a moment ago, looking like he had seen a ghost." Antonio hesitated, weighing his words carefully. He had spent enough years in the music world to know that information, once released, could never be taken back, and something about the raw vulnerability he had witnessed in Elias's playing made him unwilling to hand that vulnerability over to a man like Vincent Hale, at least not yet. "He was helping us test the acoustics of the room," Antonio said smoothly. "Nothing more." Vincent's eyes narrowed with suspicion, clearly unconvinced, but he seemed to decide it was not worth pursuing further that night. "Fine. Just make sure this hall is locked up properly when you leave. I do not want any more surprises tonight." He turned and walked out, his footsteps fading down the corridor, though the tension he left behind lingered in the room long after he was gone. Antonio watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him, and turned to find Daniel, Oliver, and Charlotte, all staring at him with wide, stunned eyes. "Maestro," Charlotte said slowly, finally breaking the silence. "Who is he really?" Antonio did not answer immediately. He walked to the piano and rested a hand on its polished lid, staring at the door through which Elias had disappeared. His mind was racing backward through decades of memory, searching for a name he had not allowed himself to think about in years. A name that had once meant everything to the world of classical music before it vanished entirely. "I am not certain yet," he said finally, "but I intend to find out." That night, long after the young musicians had gone home and the hall had fallen into darkness, Antonio remained in his office, pulling old programs and recordings from a locked cabinet he rarely opened. He searched through recordings of a competition held more than 30 years earlier, his hands moving with the same urgency Elias's had shown at the piano only hours before. He found what he was looking for near midnight, a grainy black and white photograph tucked inside a folded concert program. A young man stood at a piano, his hands raised mid-performance, his face caught in an expression of pure, transcendent focus. Antonio stared at the photograph for a long time, comparing it in his mind to the older, weathered face he had seen only hours earlier bent over the same instrument. The resemblance was unmistakable. Beneath the photograph, in small printed letters, was a name Antonio had not spoken aloud in years, a name that had once filled concert halls across the country, before disappearing entirely from public memory. He closed the program slowly, his heart pounding with the same feeling he imagined explorers must feel upon finding something the world believed had been lost forever. Meanwhile, across the city, Elias sat alone in his small apartment, his hands still trembling as he stared at the wooden box he had finally allowed himself to take down from its shelf. He held it for a long moment without opening it, listening to his own uneven breathing in the silence of the empty room. He knew, without needing anyone to tell him, that the life he had carefully built for himself over 11 quiet years had just begun to unravel, thread by thread, note by note, and there was no longer any way to stop it. He thought of Vincent Hale's warning from earlier that day, the threat hanging over his job, and wondered grimly whether being fired might actually be the simplest outcome he could hope for now. A quiet dismissal, a quick exit, no questions asked. It would hurt, certainly. It would mean starting over somewhere else, somewhere no one had heard him play, somewhere he could once again become invisible. But the alternative, the possibility that Antonio Reyes had truly recognized him for who he used to be, frightened him far more than any threat Vincent could ever make. He thought about Daniel's careless stare, the laughter that had filled the room before he sat down, and how quickly that laughter had died the moment his hands touched the keys. He thought about Charlotte's notebook, forgotten on the floor, and wondered how long it would be before her curiosity got the better of her caution. Reporters, even young ones still learning their craft, rarely let a mystery like this rest quietly for long. Most of all, he thought about the box sitting now on his lap, closed but no longer forgotten, and the photograph he knew was tucked inside it. A photograph of a much younger version of himself standing beside two people he had spent decades trying not to remember. Somewhere deep inside him, beneath the fear, beneath the panic, a small and long-forgotten part of him felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. Relief. It was a strange and unwelcome feeling, relief mixed so tightly with dread that he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. For 11 years he had told himself that silence was safety, that invisibility was a kind of peace. Tonight, for the first time, he was no longer certain that it had ever been true. 3 days passed before Antonio Reyes finally worked up the courage to knock on the door of a small apartment above a bakery on the edge of the city, the address he had found buried in an old employment file after quietly convincing a sympathetic clerk to let him look. He stood on the narrow landing, listening to the faint sound of traffic below, and knocked twice. The door opened only a crack at first, Elias's tired eyes peering out through the gap. "I told you not to say anything," Elias said quietly, though there was no real anger in his voice, only exhaustion. "I have not said a word to anyone," Antonio replied. "I give you my word on that, but I did not come here to expose you. I came here because I need to understand what happened 30 years ago, and I think you are the only person left alive who can tell me." For a long moment, Elias simply stood there, his hand still gripping the edge of the door, as though deciding whether to close it forever, or finally let it open. Then, without another word, he stepped back and allowed Antonio inside. The apartment was small and sparse, furnished with only the essentials, though a single shelf near the window held a modest collection of worn books and, tucked among them, the small wooden box Antonio had glimpsed once before in his imagination, but never in reality. Elias gestured toward a chair, and Antonio sat, watching as the older man lowered himself slowly into the seat across from him, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "My name," Elias said finally, "used to be Elias Kowalski." Antonio felt a chill run down his spine, though he had already suspected as much since the night in the rehearsal room. Hearing it confirmed aloud still struck him like a physical blow. "I saw you perform once," he said quietly. "I was a student then, barely 18 years old. You played a concert on the other side of the country, and I sat in the back row of that hall and decided, right then, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life around music, even if I could never come close to playing the way you did." A faint, sad smile crossed Elias's face. "That feels like a story about someone else's life now. Someone I used to be a very long time ago." "What happened to you?" Antonio asked gently. "You disappeared so completely. There were rumors for years. Some people said you had simply grown tired of performing. Others said something worse had happened. No one ever knew the truth." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the small wooden box on the shelf as though gathering the strength to finally open a door he had kept sealed for 30 years. "I was married," he said finally. "Her name was Margaret. We had a daughter together, Lucy, who was 7 years old the year everything changed. Margaret used to say that my hands belonged to the world, but my heart belonged only to the two of them, and she was right about that more than she ever knew." Antonio said nothing, sensing that interrupting now would only slow the story he had waited 30 years to hear. I had a concert scheduled that would change everything for my career, Elias continued, his voice growing quieter, more careful, as though each word cost him something to release. The biggest performance of my life, in front of critics who could make or break a young musician's entire future. Margaret and Lucy were driving to the hall that evening to watch me perform. Lucy had made me a small card that morning, drawn in crayon, wishing me luck. I still remember exactly what it looked like, a piano with far too many keys, and beside it, a stick-figure version of me, with an enormous, ridiculous smile. He paused, his hands tightening in his lap. They never arrived, he said simply. There was an accident on the road that evening. Heavy rain, a driver who was not paying attention, a moment of carelessness that changed everything in less time than it takes to play a single measure of music. By the time anyone reached me with the news, I had already finished the first half of my performance. I had been standing on a stage, playing for strangers, completely unaware that the two people I loved most in the world were already gone. Antonio felt his throat tighten, unable to find any words adequate enough for what he was hearing. I never played again after that night, Elias continued. Not publicly, not privately, not even alone in an empty room. Every single note reminded me of that card Lucy had drawn for me that morning, of Margaret's voice telling me she would be sitting in the third row, watching proudly the way she always did. I could not separate the music from the loss. They had become the same thing in my mind, tangled together so completely that touching a piano felt like touching an open wound. So you disappeared, Antonio said softly. I changed my name. I moved to a different city where no one would recognize me. I took whatever work I could find that had nothing to do with music, work that asked nothing of my hands except labor, nothing of my mind, except the simple task of getting through each day without breaking apart entirely. Eventually I found my way to Grand Aurora Hall, and there was a strange kind of comfort in that, being surrounded by music every single day, while never once being expected to make any of it myself. It felt, in a strange way, like being close to them again, like being close to who I used to be, without having to actually become that person. Antonio leaned forward, his expression a careful mixture of sympathy and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Elias, what you did the other night, the way you played, it was not just technically brilliant. It was alive. It was full of everything you just described to me, all of that grief and love wrapped into every single phrase. I do not think the music ever stopped being part of you. I think you simply stopped allowing yourself to feel it. Elias shook his head slowly. It does not matter now. That part of my life ended 30 years ago. I am simply the janitor at Grand Aurora Hall, and after the other night, I doubt I will even remain that for much longer. Actually, Antonio said carefully, that is partly why I came here today. There is something happening at the hall that I believe concerns you far more than you might realize. Elias frowned, sensing a shift in the conversation. What do you mean? Antonio hesitated, choosing his words with obvious care. The hall is in serious financial trouble. Vincent Hale was brought in 6 months ago, specifically to find ways to cut costs and increase revenue. And from what I understand, the board is considering some very drastic measures if the situation does not improve soon. There has been talk, quiet talk so far, about selling several of the hall's historic instruments to private collectors, including the very piano you played the other night. There has even been talk about closing an entire wing of the building permanently. Elias's expression darkened with a concern that went beyond his own personal situation. That piano has been in that hall since it was built. It belongs to the city, to the people who have performed on it for generations. I agree completely, Antonio said, which is why the board has also approved, reluctantly, one final option before any drastic decisions are made. A charity gala, 3 weeks from now, designed to raise enough emergency funding to save the hall's collection and keep everything exactly where it belongs. If the gala fails to raise sufficient funds, the sales will proceed immediately afterward, and there will be nothing anyone can do to stop them. That still does not explain why you are telling me this, Elias said, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. Antonio met his eyes steadily. Because I believe you could save that hall, Elias. I believe if the right people heard you play the way I heard you play the other night, this gala would raise more money in a single evening than the board could imagine raising in an entire year of ordinary fundraising efforts. I want you to perform. The words hung in the small apartment like a challenge neither man was fully prepared to face. Absolutely not, Elias said immediately, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. I have not performed publicly in 30 years. I do not even own a suit appropriate for a stage. I have spent 3 decades building a life specifically designed to avoid exactly what you are asking me to do. I understand that this is an enormous request, Antonio said calmly, remaining seated despite Elias's obvious agitation. But think about what that hall means to this city. Think about every young musician who has walked through its doors and found their voice on that very stage. Vincent Hale sees numbers on a balance sheet. He does not understand what that building represents. I believe you do, better than almost anyone alive. Elias paced the small room, his hands trembling at his sides. You are asking me to stand in front of hundreds of people and play the same music that reminds me every single time of the two people I lost. Do you understand what you are asking? I do understand, Antonio said quietly, and I would never ask if I believed there was any other way. But I heard you play the other night, Elias, and I do not believe that music has been hurting you all these years. I believe silence has been hurting you. I believe you buried your grief so deeply that you also buried the one thing that might have helped you carry it. Elias stopped pacing, his back to Antonio, his shoulders rigid with tension. Outside, the sound of traffic continued uninterrupted, indifferent to the enormous decision unfolding within the small apartment. I need time to think, Elias said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Antonio said, rising from his chair. But Elias, time is the one thing none of us have very much of right now. The gala is in 3 weeks. If you decide to help, we will need every single one of those days to prepare. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. There is one more thing you should know. A young journalist named Charlotte Byrne was in the room the other night. She is talented, ambitious, and already asking questions around the hall about who you really are. I have managed to keep her curiosity contained so far, but I cannot promise that will last much longer. If this story comes out before you are ready, before you have had a chance to decide how you want to tell it, I fear the consequences could be far more painful than anything a gala performance might bring. He left without waiting for a response, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving Elias alone in the small apartment with 30 years of grief and a decision that felt, for the first time in decades, entirely too large to carry by himself. Across the city, in the cramped newsroom of a local paper where she worked part-time while finishing her music studies, Charlotte Byrne sat hunched over her laptop, scrolling through old newspaper archives with the focused intensity of someone who sensed she was standing on the edge of something important. She had already searched a dozen variations of names and dates, following a hunch that had taken root the moment she watched the janitor's hands move across the piano keys, with a mastery no ordinary person could simply stumble into by accident. She found the first match just after midnight. A grainy photograph, scanned from a decades-old newspaper, showed a young pianist accepting flowers after what the caption described as a triumphant debut performance. The face in the photograph was younger, smoother, but something about the eyes, something about the particular way the man held his hands slightly curled even at rest, felt unmistakably familiar. Beneath the photograph, a second, smaller article from only weeks later carried a very different tone. A tragic accident. A young family lost. A promising career that appeared to end as suddenly and completely as it had begun. Charlotte read the short article 3 times, her heart pounding, before leaning back in her chair and staring at the ceiling. She thought about her own promise as a journalist, the discipline she had been taught about verifying facts before publishing anything, about respecting the privacy of people who had suffered enough already. But she also thought about ambition, about how rarely a reporter as young as herself stumbled onto a story this remarkable, buried inside the walls of a building she walked through nearly every single day. She closed her laptop slowly, torn between 2 competing instincts that felt, in that quiet moment, almost equally powerful. She decided, for now, to wait. But she also decided, quietly and firmly, that she would not wait forever. Meanwhile, at Grand Aurora Hall the following morning, Vincent Hale stood before the hall's board of directors in a windowless conference room, presenting a series of charts and figures that painted an increasingly grim picture of the building's finances. Maintenance costs had risen steadily for years while ticket sales had failed to keep pace, and the hall's aging infrastructure required repairs that the current budget simply could not support. The gala is our final opportunity, Vincent said, tapping a finger against the projected numbers on the screen behind him. If it fails to raise the necessary funds, I recommend we proceed immediately with the sale of the Steinway and the Renoir piece currently displayed in the East Gallery. Both would attract significant interest from private collectors, and both sales combined would resolve our immediate financial concerns for at least the next 3 years. One of the older board members, a silver-haired woman named Margaret Ashford who had served on the board for over 20 years, frowned deeply at the suggestion. That piano has been part of this hall's identity since it opened. Selling it feels like selling a piece of the building's soul. With respect, Vincent replied, his tone clipped and businesslike. Souls do not pay maintenance bills. I understand the sentimental value, but sentiment will not keep the roof from leaking or the heating system from failing next winter. I would rather preserve the building itself than preserve a single instrument inside it. The board eventually agreed, reluctantly, to give the gala its full support, though the tension in the room made clear that everyone present understood exactly how much was riding on a single evening only 3 weeks away. Vincent left the meeting already calculating contingency plans, unwilling to leave the hall's future dependent entirely on hope. Elias sank slowly back into his chair, staring at the small wooden box on the shelf across the room. After a long moment he rose, crossed the room, and lifted it down with careful, trembling hands. Inside, exactly where he had left it 30 years earlier, was a folded piece of paper, its crayon drawing faded slightly with age but still unmistakably clear. A piano, with far too many keys. Beside it, a stick figure with an enormous, ridiculous smile. Elias held the drawing against his chest and, for the first time in 30 years, allowed himself to cry without immediately trying to stop. He sat like that for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, memories rising up around him faster than he could keep them at bay. He remembered Margaret's laughter, the way she used to hum along quietly while he practiced, always slightly off-key, always utterly unashamed of it. He remembered Lucy's small fingers reaching up to press a single key on the piano whenever she thought he was not watching, giggling at the sound she had made all by herself. For 30 years he had treated these memories as wounds to be avoided, sharp edges he could not risk touching without breaking apart entirely. But sitting there, holding the faded crayon drawing, he found himself wondering, for the first time, whether Antonio had been right. Perhaps the music itself had never been the source of his pain. Perhaps it had simply been the messenger, carrying grief he had never allowed himself to properly feel, let alone release. He thought about the piano in Grand Aurora Hall, the very instrument that had, quite by accident, become one of the few threads still connecting him to the person he used to be. He thought about the possibility of that piano being sold away to some private collector's living room, silenced forever behind closed doors where no one would ever again hear it played the way it deserved to be played. And slowly, carefully, like a man testing ice he was not certain would hold his weight, Elias allowed himself to consider, for the very first time in 3 decades, that perhaps stepping back onto a stage might not destroy him after all. Perhaps it might be the only thing left capable of putting him back together. The following evening, Elias returned to Grand Aurora Hall after his shift had officially ended, standing outside Antonio's office door for nearly 5 full minutes before finally gathering the courage to knock. When Antonio opened the door and saw who was standing there, his expression shifted immediately from surprise to something close to relief. "I will do it," Elias said, before Antonio could say a single word. "The gala. I will perform. But I need you to understand something first. I have not touched a piano properly in 30 years except for that single evening. My hands remember the music, but my body does not remember the discipline, the endurance, the sheer physical demand of a full performance. 3 weeks is not very much time." "Then we should not waste another moment of it," Antonio said, already reaching for his coat. "Come with me." Over the following days, the two men fell into an intense and exhausting routine. Every evening after the hall had emptied of staff and patrons, Antonio unlocked the rehearsal room and worked with Elias for hours at a time, rebuilding decades of lost technique, one careful session at a time. Elias's hands ached in ways they had not ached since his youth, old muscles reawakening painfully after 30 years of dormancy, but he pushed through the discomfort with a determination that surprised even himself. "Again," Antonio would say, whenever Elias's fingers stumbled over a difficult passage. "From the beginning. Do not let your hands rest until they remember exactly what they are capable of." Elias, breathing hard, would nod and begin again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air drifting through the rehearsal room's tall windows. There were nights when frustration nearly overwhelmed him entirely, when his fingers simply refused to cooperate, when memories of Margaret and Lucy rose up so suddenly and so powerfully that he had to stop playing altogether and sit in silence until the wave of grief passed enough for him to continue. Antonio never rushed him during these moments. He simply waited, quietly, understanding instinctively that this process was about far more than technical preparation. Word of Elias's secret began spreading slowly through the small circle of people who already knew, despite everyone's best efforts at discretion. Daniel Cole and Oliver Hunt, sworn to secrecy, found themselves increasingly curious about the late-night sessions happening behind the rehearsal room's closed doors, occasionally lingering near the hallway just to catch fragments of the extraordinary music drifting through the walls. Charlotte Byrne, meanwhile, continued her own quiet investigation, though she had made a personal decision to hold off on writing anything until she better understood the full situation. She approached Antonio directly one afternoon, catching him alone in the hallway outside his office. "I know who he used to be," she said simply, watching Antonio's expression carefully for confirmation. "I found the old articles, the performance, the accident. I have not written a single word about it, and I do not intend to, without speaking to him directly first. But I need you to know that I know." Antonio studied her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. "He is preparing to perform at the gala," he said finally. "After 30 years of silence, he is finally ready to play again. I would ask you, as someone who clearly cares about doing this responsibly, to let him tell his own story, in his own time, rather than having it discovered before he is ready." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I can respect that, but Maestro Reyes, if this story is even half as remarkable as I believe it is, other people are going to find out eventually, whether from me or from someone far less careful with the details. I would rather it come from someone who genuinely cares about getting it right." "Then perhaps," Antonio said thoughtfully, "there is a way for both things to happen. Let him perform first. Let the music speak before any words do. If he chooses to share his story afterward, I believe you would be exactly the right person to help him tell it properly." It was not quite an agreement, but it was enough for Charlotte to nod and walk away satisfied, at least for the moment. The greater challenge, however, came from Vincent Hale, who remained entirely unaware of the extraordinary preparations happening within his own building each evening. He continued pressing the board for contingency plans, quietly arranging preliminary conversations with private collectors interested in the historic Steinway, determined not to leave the hall's future dependent on what he privately considered an unlikely miracle. 10 days before the gala, Vincent discovered the truth by accident, arriving at the hall later than usual one evening to retrieve forgotten paperwork, only to hear unmistakable piano music drifting from the rehearsal room where he knew no scheduled rehearsal existed. He approached quietly, drawn by curiosity, and stopped in the doorway, stunned to see Elias seated at the piano while Antonio stood nearby offering quiet instruction. "What?" Vincent said sharply, causing both men to startle. Antonio straightened immediately, stepping slightly in front of Elias as though instinctively trying to shield him from confrontation. "Vincent, I can explain." "I would very much like you to," Vincent said, crossing his arms, his eyes moving between the two men with obvious suspicion. "Because from where I am standing, it looks like our janitor has somehow become a piano student under the hall's resident maestro, using hall resources after hours without my authorization." "He is not becoming a piano student," Antonio said carefully. "He is a former concert pianist, one of the finest this country has ever produced, and he has agreed to perform at the gala in 10 days to help save this hall's collection." Vincent's expression shifted rapidly from suspicion to disbelief. "You cannot possibly be serious. The janitor, performing at our most important fundraising event in years, in front of donors, critics, and half the city's wealthiest patrons." "I am completely serious," Antonio replied, "and I would ask you to trust me on this, Vincent, even though I understand how difficult that must sound. What he can do at that piano defies explanation. It needs to be witnessed, not described." Vincent turned to Elias, studying him with an expression that had softened only slightly, still clearly skeptical. "Is this true? You were once a professional performer?" Elias met his gaze steadily, though his hands remained folded tightly in his lap. "It is true, though it was a very long time ago, and under very different circumstances." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing instincts of his own. Finally he exhaled sharply. "Fine. I will allow this to proceed, purely because we have no better alternative at this point, and because the board has made clear that failure is simply not an acceptable outcome. But understand this. If this does not go exactly as planned, if there is any hint of disaster during that performance, the consequences will fall on all of us, and I will not hesitate to proceed with the original plan regarding the collection immediately afterward." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor, leaving both men standing in tense silence. "He is not wrong to worry," Elias said quietly, once Vincent had gone. "There is a great deal riding on this, perhaps too much." "There is a great deal riding on it," Antonio agreed. "But I have heard you play, Elias. I have watched these past 10 days as your hands slowly remembered everything they once knew. I do not believe you are going to fail." Despite Antonio's confidence, the following days brought their own share of difficulties. 3 nights before the gala, during a particularly demanding passage requiring rapid, precise movement across the full range of the keyboard, Elias's hands suddenly seized with pain, so sharp he cried out and pulled away from the piano entirely, cradling his right hand against his chest. "It is nothing," he insisted. though his face had gone pale. Simply muscle strain. 30 years of neglect does not repair itself easily in only 3 weeks. Antonio insisted on calling a physician the following morning, who confirmed exactly what Elias had suspected. Mild tendon strain from the sudden intensity of practice after decades of inactivity, requiring rest and careful management rather than continued aggressive rehearsal. Rest is not something we have very much of, Elias said grimly, staring at his bandaged hand later that evening. Then we adjust the program, Antonio said firmly. We simplify certain passages, protect your hand as much as possible during these final days, and trust that what you are able to give on the night itself will be more than enough. This performance was never going to be about technical perfection alone, Elias. It is going to be about truth, and I do not believe an injured hand can diminish that truth in the slightest. Elias nodded slowly, though worry remained etched clearly across his face. With only 3 days remaining before the gala, and his hand still aching with every careful movement, he found himself wondering, for the first time since agreeing to perform, whether he had made a promise he might not be able to keep. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on Charlotte Byrne from an entirely different direction. Her editor, a sharp-tongued man named Gregory Finch, who had built his reputation on breaking stories before anyone else, called her into his office 2 days before the gala, having caught wind of rumors circulating among the hall's donor community about a mysterious surprise performer. I am hearing things, Byrne, Gregory said, leaning back in his chair. Whispers about some hidden talent set to perform at the Grand Aurora Gala. You work near that hall constantly. Tell me you know something about this. Charlotte hesitated, torn between loyalty to her profession and the promise she had made to Antonio. I might know a few things, she admitted carefully, but I am not ready to publish anything yet. There is a person at the center of this story who deserves the chance to tell it on his own terms, once he is ready. This business does not wait for people to feel ready, Gregory said sharply. If you know something, and you sit on it, someone else is going to find it, and publish first, and then we will have lost the story entirely. I want something on my desk before that gala happens, even if it is only a teaser piece hinting at a surprise performer. Do you understand me? I understand, Charlotte said, though her stomach twisted uncomfortably at the thought of breaking her word. She left his office that afternoon carrying a decision she was not yet ready to make, caught between the ambition that had brought her into journalism in the first place and a growing respect for the fragile, painful story she had stumbled into almost by accident. She thought about Elias's trembling hands at the piano that first night, the raw vulnerability she had witnessed before he even realized anyone was truly watching. She thought about the newspaper clipping describing the accident that had taken his family, and how casually the world might consume that tragedy as simple entertainment, if she allowed it to be published without care. By the time she reached her apartment that evening, she had made a quiet decision of her own, one she intended to keep regardless of what her editor demanded. Back at Grand Aurora Hall, Daniel and Oliver had taken to watching the rehearsals from just outside the door most evenings, their earlier mockery long since replaced by something closer to quiet awe. When word reached them of Elias's injured hand, both young musicians appeared unexpectedly at his apartment the following afternoon, carrying a small bag of ice and an even smaller amount of remaining confidence between them. We wanted to apologize, Daniel said awkwardly, standing in the doorway while Oliver hovered behind him. For the way we treated you that first night, we had no idea who you really were, obviously. But that is not really an excuse. We were unkind, and we are sorry. Elias, surprised by the visit, invited them inside and offered them tea, which Oliver accepted gratefully while Daniel continued glancing nervously around the modest apartment. You do not owe me an apology, Elias said gently, settling into his chair with his bandaged hand resting carefully in his lap. Curiosity is not unkindness, even when it comes wrapped in laughter. I have spent 30 years being invisible. In a strange way, that night reminded me what it felt like to be seen again, even if the circumstances were not entirely comfortable. Is it true you might not be able to perform because of your hand? Oliver asked quietly. It is a possibility, Elias admitted, though Antonio and I are doing everything we can to prevent that outcome. Daniel leaned forward, his earlier awkwardness replaced by something more sincere. If there is anything we can do to help, anything at all, we want to help. That performance the other night changed something in both of us. I do not think either of us fully understood what music could actually feel like until we heard you play. Elias studied the two young musicians for a long moment, touched by the sincerity in their offer despite everything that had happened only weeks earlier. There may actually be something you can help with, he said finally. Antonio mentioned he might adjust certain passages of the program to protect my hand. Perhaps, if you are both willing, we could discuss a small addition to the evening. Something that might ease the physical demand on me while still honoring what this performance is meant to represent. The idea took shape slowly over the following hour, the three of them talking quietly in the small apartment as afternoon light shifted gradually toward evening, a fragile plan beginning to form that none of them could have imagined only a few weeks earlier. That night, alone in his apartment, he opened the small wooden box once more and unfolded Lucy's faded crayon drawing, staring at it for a long time in the quiet darkness. "I am trying," he whispered softly to the empty room. "I promise you, I am trying." The night of the gala arrived with a cold, clear sky stretched over the city, stars faintly visible above the glowing windows of Grand Aurora Hall, as guests in formal attire streamed through its grand entrance. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across a room filled with donors, critics, and city officials, all gathered for an evening they believed would determine the future of the hall's historic collection. Backstage, Elias stood in a small dressing room wearing a simple black suit that Antonio had insisted on purchasing for him days earlier, staring at his own reflection in a mirror he barely recognized. His bandaged hand had improved slightly over the final days, though a dull ache still lingered beneath the surface, a quiet reminder of exactly how much was riding on the next hour of his life. "You do not have to do this," Antonio said quietly, appearing in the doorway. "If your hand is not ready, if you are not ready, no one here would think less of you for stepping back." Elias turned to face him, his expression calm despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "I have spent 30 years stepping back, Antonio. Tonight, I intend to step forward, whatever the outcome." Vincent Hale paced anxiously near the stage entrance, checking his watch every few minutes, his earlier skepticism now tangled with a nervous hope he refused to fully admit even to himself. Nearby, Charlotte Burns stood with her notebook tucked against her chest, having finally informed her editor that whatever story emerged from tonight's performance would be told with care, or not told by her at all. Daniel and Oliver waited just off stage as well, having spent the final days helping Antonio quietly rearrange small portions of the evening's program. Their earlier mockery transformed entirely into something resembling protective loyalty. 10 minutes before the performance, a nervous stagehand rushed backstage with troubling news. A sudden electrical fault had caused one of the stage's overhead lighting rigs to flicker unpredictably, and the hall's technical crew was scrambling to determine whether it was safe to proceed without a delay. Vincent, already tense, nearly lost his composure entirely at the news, pacing back and forth while muttering about the timing of the malfunction. "We cannot delay," Antonio said firmly, following the technical director toward the lighting panel. "Half our donors have other commitments later this evening. If we push this back even 20 minutes, we risk losing a significant portion of our audience before Elias even sits down at the piano." The technical director worked quickly, isolating the faulty circuit and rerouting power through a backup system, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool backstage air. 3 tense minutes passed before he finally straightened and gave a thumbs up, confirming the lights were stable. Antonio exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him, though the small crisis had left everyone backstage even more on edge than before. Elias, watching the commotion from his dressing room doorway, felt his own nerves tightening further with every passing second. He flexed his injured hand slowly, testing the ache that still lingered beneath the surface, and wondered, not for the first time that evening, whether the universe itself seemed determined to test his resolve before allowing him back onto a stage. "Ready?" Antonio asked, appearing beside him once the lighting issue had been resolved. "No," Elias admitted honestly, "but I do not believe I will ever feel ready. I think perhaps that is simply not how this works." Antonio placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then we do not wait for ready. We simply walk forward anyway." At exactly 8 o'clock, the hall's lights dimmed, and Antonio stepped onto the stage to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily through the silent auditorium. "Tonight," he began, "you are here because you believe, as I do, that this hall represents something far greater than the sum of its instruments and its architecture. It represents every performer who has ever found their voice within these walls, and every audience member who has ever been changed by what they heard here. Tonight, I have the extraordinary privilege of introducing someone who embodies exactly that truth, though I suspect very few of you realize you have already met him." A murmur rippled through the crowd, curiosity mingling with confusion. "For 11 years, Antonio continued, this man has walked through Grand Aurora Hall every single day, largely unnoticed, performing work that many of you likely never thought twice about. What almost none of you know is that decades ago, this same man stood on stages very much like this one, celebrated as one of the most extraordinary pianists of his generation, before a devastating personal tragedy caused him to disappear entirely from public life." The murmur grew louder, several audience members exchanging astonished glances. Tonight, after 30 years of silence, He has chosen to return to this stage, not for fame, not for recognition, but because he believes, as we all do, that this hall, and everything it represents, deserves to be protected. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elias Kowalski. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, uncertain, the audience unsure exactly what to expect. Then Elias stepped from the wings into the warm glow of the stage lights, walking slowly toward the piano that had waited patiently for him for 11 long years, and the applause grew steadily louder, though still tinged with curious disbelief. He seated himself at the bench, the same bench where this entire journey had begun weeks earlier, in an empty rehearsal room. He glanced briefly toward the wings, where Antonio, Daniel, Oliver, and Charlotte all stood watching, their expressions a mixture of hope and quiet anxiety. He glanced toward Vincent Hale, standing rigidly near the stage entrance, his future and the hall's future both balanced precariously on the next several minutes. Elias closed his eyes briefly, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw Margaret smile, heard Lucy's small, delighted laughter, as she pressed a single piano key with one curious finger. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper, worn soft with age, and placed it carefully on the piano's music stand where he could see it clearly. A piano with far too many keys. Beside it, a stick figure with an enormous, ridiculous smile. He placed his hands gently on the keys and began to play. The first notes rang out clear and pure through the silent auditorium, and immediately the entire room seemed to shift, every conversation dying instantly, every restless movement stilling completely. The piece he had chosen was the same one Margaret had loved most, a piece filled with both sorrow and hope, woven so tightly together that separating them felt impossible, exactly the way his own grief and love had remained impossibly tangled for 30 long years. His injured hand ached with every demanding passage, but he pushed through the pain, drawing on something far deeper than physical strength, something that had been waiting patiently inside him for 3 decades to finally be released. The melody built steadily, rising and falling with an emotional intensity that seemed to reach into every single person seated in that vast hall, pulling them along on a journey none of them had expected when they arrived that evening. Midway through the piece, exactly at the passage Antonio and the 2 young musicians had quietly reworked over the previous days, to ease the strain on his injured hand, Elias felt a brief flicker of doubt, his fingers hesitating for the smallest fraction of a second over the keys. In that instant, he glanced toward the wings and caught Daniel's eye, the young violinist offering the faintest, most encouraging nod, as though silently reminding him that the adjustment had been made exactly for this moment, exactly so he would not have to face it alone. The hesitation passed as quickly as it had come, and his hands continued forward, steady once more, carried by trust as much as by memory. The audience seemed entirely unaware of the small mechanical crisis, or the quiet adjustments that had shaped the evening, aware only of the sound filling the hall around them, a sound that seemed to grow richer and more urgent with every passing measure. Somewhere in the 3rd row, an elderly man closed his eyes, his hand finding his wife's beside him. Near the back, a young violin student who had once dreamed of studying under Antonio Reyes leaned forward in her seat, transfixed, memorizing every detail of a performance she instinctively understood she would tell her own students about decades from now. Charlotte, watching from the wings, felt tears sliding freely down her face, her earlier journalistic detachment completely abandoned. Daniel and Oliver stood perfectly still, barely breathing, witnessing something they both instinctively understood they would remember for the rest of their lives. Even Vincent Hale, arms crossed rigidly at first, found his posture slowly softening, his skepticism dissolving note by note into something that looked remarkably like genuine emotion. As the piece approached its final demanding passage, Elias's injured hand trembled visibly, pain flashing sharply across his face for just a moment. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing the vulnerability of the moment, but Elias pressed forward, his fingers finding strength from somewhere beyond simple muscle and tendon, carrying the melody through to its full, aching conclusion. The final note rang out and slowly faded into absolute silence. For one suspended moment, nobody in the hall moved. Then, somewhere near the front, an elderly woman rose slowly to her feet, her hands coming together in solitary applause. Beside her, another guest stood, then another, until the entire audience rose as one, thunderous applause filling the hall and echoing off the painted ceilings that had witnessed countless performances over more than a century, though few, perhaps none, quite like this one. Antonio Reyes walked onto the stage, unable to contain the emotion visible on his own face, and embraced Elias tightly, as the applause continued to swell around them. Elias, overwhelmed, allowed himself finally to weep openly in front of hundreds of strangers. 30 years of carefully guarded grief, finally finding release in front of the very community he had spent so long avoiding. The gala's financial results, revealed later that evening, exceeded every expectation the board had dared to hope for. Donors moved by the performance pledged far more than the amount needed to preserve the hall's collection, several wealthy patrons personally guaranteeing additional support for the historic Steinway's ongoing maintenance for years to come. Vincent Hale, standing near the stage as the final pledges were announced, found himself, for the first time since arriving at the hall, genuinely smiling. He approached Elias backstage afterward, extending a hand that had, until recently, seemed prepared only to dismiss him. "I owe you an apology," Vincent said quietly. "I judged you unfairly, and I very nearly cost this hall something irreplaceable because of it. Thank you for what you did tonight." Elias accepted the handshake warmly. "You were simply trying to protect something you cared about, in the only way you knew how. I understand that better than most." In the weeks that followed, Charlotte finally wrote her story, though it looked nothing like the sensational scoop her editor had originally demanded. She spent several afternoons sitting with Elias in his small apartment, notebook in hand, listening carefully as he shared pieces of Margaret and Lucy that he had kept hidden away for 30 years. Memories he found, to his own surprise, easier to speak aloud with each passing conversation. Charlotte wrote slowly and carefully, rewriting entire sections multiple times, determined to honor the trust Elias had placed in her, rather than simply chase the most dramatic version of events. When the article finally published, under the simple headline announcing the return of a forgotten master, it looked nothing like the teaser piece Gregory Finch had originally demanded. Instead, with Elias's full cooperation and blessing, she crafted a careful, compassionate account of his journey, from tragedy to silence, to unexpected redemption, a story that spread far beyond the city's local papers and touched readers across the entire country. Letters began arriving at the hall from strangers who had lost loved ones of their own, thanking Elias for reminding them that grief and beauty could exist together without one destroying the other. Gregory, reading the finished piece, admitted grudgingly to Charlotte that she had been right to wait, and the article went on to win a small but meaningful award for feature writing later that year, an accolade Charlotte insisted on sharing credit for with Elias himself. Antonio, meanwhile, offered Elias a formal position at the hall as a piano instructor, working closely with promising young students including, somewhat fittingly, both Daniel and Oliver, who had appointed themselves his most devoted and enthusiastic pupils. Elias accepted, though he insisted on keeping a small portion of his old janitorial duties as well, joking quietly that 11 years of pushing a cleaning cart had taught him more patience than 3 decades of piano lessons ever could. Daniel, whose technical skill on the violin had always outpaced his emotional expression, found himself transformed under Elias's gentle guidance, learning slowly to let vulnerability into his playing, rather than hiding behind flawless execution alone. Oliver, meanwhile, began composing his own small pieces for the first time, encouraged by Elias's insistence that music was as much about honest feeling as it was about correct notes. Within a year, both young musicians had grown into performers markedly different from the confident but somewhat hollow players they had been the night they first dared an old janitor to sit down at a piano. Grand Aurora Hall itself underwent a quiet transformation in the months that followed, its historic collection fully preserved, its financial future secured, and a small brass plaque eventually added near the entrance of the main rehearsal room, honoring the extraordinary night and unexpected performance saved everything the building had stood for across more than a century. On quiet evenings, long after the hall had emptied of visitors, Elias could often still be found seated at the same piano, playing softly, for no audience at all except perhaps, in his own quiet imagination, for Margaret and Lucy, wherever their laughter still echoed. The small crayon drawing remained tucked permanently now inside the piano's music stand, no longer hidden away in a locked box but kept close, exactly where it belonged. Vincent Hale, too, found himself changed by the events of that gala, though far more quietly than anyone else involved. He remained the hall's general manager for several more years, but colleagues noticed a subtle shift in the way he approached decisions afterward, weighing the intangible value of history and meaning alongside the numbers on his spreadsheets, rather than dismissing sentiment entirely. He never became sentimental himself, not exactly, but he learned, in his own careful way, to recognize when something mattered beyond what could be measured in a budget report, and that lesson stayed with him long after the memory of that particular evening had softened into simply another story told around the hall. Margaret Ashford, the board member who had first objected to selling the historic Steinway, made a point of attending every performance Elias gave in the years that followed. always seated in the same spot in the third row. A detail Elias noticed but never mentioned aloud, though it warmed something quiet and grateful inside him each time he saw her there. He had spent 30 years believing silence was the only way to survive his grief. It had taken a stranger's dare, a maestro's persistence, and one trembling first note to finally teach him otherwise. Music, he had come to understand, was never the wound at all. It had always been the healing, patiently waiting for him to find his way back to it. Sometimes, late in the evening, students still rehearsing in nearby rooms would pause what they were doing simply to listen, drawn by the sound of an old man playing softly for no one in particular, unaware that they were witnessing, in that quiet and unremarkable moment, the very same gift that had once filled concert halls across an entire country, and that had finally, after 30 long years, found its way home again. And every single evening, as the last light faded from the tall windows of Grand Aurora Hall, Elias Kowalski played on, no longer invisible, no longer hiding, finally and completely himself again.